Welcome to Books in Action. My name's Melissa Kopecki. I'm the director of the South Orange Public Library and a sometimes host of Books in Action. And tonight I get the fun of hosting the other hosts. So we have Jim and Larry and Jim's daughter Sarah. And we're here just to have some conversations about books. So we hope you'll join us. We have a table full of books here. I think we'll be sort of democratic here and start off with one book apiece. So go ahead, Jim. Start with something, and I'll hand you the book if you want me to grab you something.
Well, the book I'm currently reading right now is War and Peace, the new translation. And it's a book that is probably the same length as the Bible. The translation is wonderful. I must say that it's very, very good. And I don't recall having read it before. I read a lot of the Russian novels, but somehow I don't remember having read this one. And given the length, you think you would remember having read it.
At some point, you'd stumble across something that sounded familiar.
Yeah, but it is an amazing piece of work. And I think I would recommend it to anyone, but you must be patient. We can put this one
You know
back.
what? Actually, that reminds me of a question before we go on to another book. When you're reading something, particularly as massive and as classic as War and Peace, do you just stick with that one book? Do you read only that, or are you reading other books on the side as well?
No. If I get started in something like this, I just have to put my head down and keep going. I have a problem generally with novels, which is why I don't read them very often, which is that once a novel captures me, I will stay up to 1 a.m., whatever, until it's done. And I usually end up falling asleep at work. So I tried to read histories because I can put those down and go to bed.
So instead you pick up a really long novel, so you can be up a lot of nights with that one.
It's actually closer to a history, except for the sections where he's analyzing the Russian society. But the actual war sections are very, very historical.
Can I just take that question over to you all, too? Are you ever reading multiple books at a time, Larry, or do you just pretty much get through one and then pick up the next?
No, I usually wind up reading more than one thing at a time. Right now I'm reading a book called American Creation, and I do that when I go to the gym in the morning because it occupies a half hour. And I'm reading a book, American Creation by Joseph Ellis. It's about the founding of the Republic of the United States. And he's trying to take a slightly different tact and maybe look at some of the things that aren't so well known. And in a sense, rather than to glamorize everything, to maybe uncover some of the blemishes instead of putting makeup on them. So it's kind of interesting in that regard. It's a little bit sort of a different perspective. The other thing I'm reading is not quite the size of War and Peace, but it's called The Day of Battle by Rick Atkinson. It's the second of this, what he's calling, I think, the Liberation Trilogy. It's about World War II, the European theater. I'm assuming it's the European theater. The first book was about the war in North Africa, which was kind of intriguing because I find that so many times our conception of World War II is all that stuff that happened in the Pacific and the invasion of Normandy, but there was a whole lot of stuff that happened prior to that. And like, for example, we were fighting the French apparently in North Africa, little things like that. So I'll read that, and then usually I'll have if it shows up, I have a science fiction magazine I may be reading at the time, and I like to read the Atlantic Monthly. And so I may be reading more than one thing at a time, but and in addition to that, if the book club I belong to has a book, I'll be reading that. Usually I have a book that I can fall asleep with. That one usually takes me a very long time to read.
I'm always envious of people who can do that. I could switch from a book to a magazine, but for some reason I'm just unable to be reading more than I'm like you, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I get sucked into a book. I can't do two at once, even if it's different times of day or whatever. So I think that's really a wonderful thing. Look at how many different things you're reading at the moment.
Yeah, well, I didn't say I remembered any of that.
How many sheep?
Yeah, I was going to ask Sarah the same thing.
I'm reading Father Brown Mysteries, and I'm also reading our literature book, which is Good Brother, Bad Brother. It's about...
You actually brought that,
Yeah.
didn't you? Let me hold it up and you can tell us what it's about.
It's about John Wilkes Booth and Edwin Booth, and it's kind of like it's a double biography simultaneously.
So this is something that you'll then be discussing in school?
Yes.
Larry was just talking about having a book club. Do you find that's a really different experience, reading a book that you're just reading on your own and you end up not really talking to somebody about, and then reading something that gets discussed a lot? Which way do you like to do it?
Well, I like reading books that get discussed a lot because my literature teacher, she always goes really in depth. So you understand the book more.
And you think about things you wouldn't have otherwise.
Mhm.
So Larry belongs to a book group, so they have books that they discuss a lot too. And do you find that that adds a lot to what you're reading?
Yeah, I think it does. It's been going on for a long time, and the focus on this thing is in general, with occasional exceptions, the classics. Books that were written, maybe even earlier than the G.K. Chesterton novels that Sarah's written, but might go back to the 16th, 15th centuries, things of that nature. And the discussions are always kind of interesting because no matter how hard we try, I think it's difficult for us to take our 21st century perspective and try to remove that from the way we're reading the book if it was written 300, 400, 500, 600 years ago. Because we still evaluate things of that age in terms of our own perspective today. And I find that kind of paradoxical and intriguing at the same time. So I like reading these older books because it's really a window on a part of a time that really we've got really no conception of.
That's a really unique perception for readers to try to have. I mean, that's one of the things in a literature class you'd be talking about, what's the worldview of the author, but people don't usually jump back a couple centuries and do that. And do you find yourself in places where you're discussing what you're reading, or are you pretty much just read it and process it on your own?
I'm very much of a solo reader at this point.
I'm kind of with you on that. That's how
Yeah.
I tend to do, although one of the things I've taken on is doing a lot of reading at work. I do a lot of the young adult reading. We call it YA, so it's a middle school, high school, and occasionally something that I will find and recommend to everybody, of which I brought one tonight that I would recommend to anybody not to a little kid, but for adults certainly. So I'm going to throw in mine here right now. It's called Rash, and it's a young adult novel, which in itself is a really interesting field because, there used to not be such a thing as young adult novels. It was sort of like you'd find some things written for adults that were suitable. There was certainly a children's market, and that became a little bit older, but this is probably the most exploding field in book publishing in like the last 10 years. And there used to be, everybody's heard of the Newbery medals, the Caldecott medals for picture books and children's literature, but there was never anything for the teenage sort of years, a lot of which deals with really serious subjects. And now there are growing amounts of awards, one in particular, the Michael Prinz Award, that's an annual award awarded at the same time as the Newbery and the Caldecott. So all of a sudden it's this whole new body of literature. But this I just really love because it puts your head in a different place, and unlike Larry's book group, it doesn't put your head back in the past. It puts it just a little bit in the future. Like the kid in here, his grandfather is perhaps your age, grown to grandfather age. And so we're not that far in the future. And the premise is that everything has become so much safer, that nothing is done. Like the grandfather will tell this kid about the track times that people used to have, because in the future the kids aren't allowed to run bare, in shorts on a hard track, because that would be way too dangerous. So they're running on a very bouncy, soft track, and they're wearing all sorts of protective gear in case they fall. So their times are radically slower. It's just very funny. Kids are actually sent to juvenile detention centers if they overeat, if they do things that are unhealthy. And that the whole society has become. Isn't that just a great idea? The whole society has grown to protect everybody to such an extent that you're punished if you aren't being safe. So, so actually, this kid does get sent off to a prison camp where one of the entertainments is they play football in the old way, you know, without, you know, football is actually a sport that is illegal because it's just entirely too dangerous in this future universe. So in the prison, they're playing football as a blood sport. So it's just very, very, I love the premise. It's very, very funny. So let me jump from that, though, while we're talking about time, and I know you two are history readers, but Sarah was telling me about one of her favorite books, which is actually a historical novel, so we get to go back in time on this one, so tell us about it.
It's called Catherine Called Birdie. It's about a girl from the medieval ages, and she is always trying to do things that women then were not supposed to do. She was always scaring off her suitors. She is always doing exactly the opposite of what she's supposed to be doing.
When I read that book, I thought it was one of the best, like, sort of being submerged in the Middle Ages that I'd ever had, and I got to laugh at the same time, which was great. But one of the things I love, and it's written in the form of a diary,
Yeah.
and she counts the fleas that she picked off herself or out of her clothing every day. And if you really want to be brought back to what would it have been like to live in medieval times, just the concept of counting the fleas that you pick off yourself was a really pretty good way to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. She talks about spinning cloth, and sometimes she writes if she tangled something or she didn't, and she made deals with her parents about not having to spin if she wrote in her diary and such like that, just so she wouldn't have to do the things that she had to.
And you, being a very good reader, pointed out to me the other thing that was written by the same author, right? Which is set in the same general time period. You want to tell us what that is?
It's called Midwife's Apprentice.
And that one actually won an award, and this won an honor. And The Midwife's Apprentice is really a fairly serious take on the time, whereas this is just a very humorous one. And which did you prefer?
I preferred Catherine Called Birdie.
But a nice thing too, that's another one that I have handed to adults and said, you know, it's a very fast read. Take a few minutes and read it. Do you ever hand stuff to your dad to read?
Yes.
And does he read it?
Yeah, most of the time.
She handed me that, and I read Catherine Called Birdie.
Oh, and did you love it too?
I thought it was a very good book.
Oh, okay. Did it make you laugh out loud?
I don't think it made me laugh out loud, but I certainly was grinning a great deal.
Okay. We're going to need to wrap up here and take a break for a minute, but you got to say something positive about a book that makes you laugh about being put back in a time of fleas and no sanitation. And you two history readers who go back seriously. So we will take a break, and then we'll come back, and we have still piles of books to talk about. Thank you so much, and we'll be back.
Faster than searching the World Wide Web, more inspiring than a half-cap mocha latte, able to answer any question with insight and detail. This superhero of knowledge can find the answer to any question no matter what the problem, and she works in your neighborhood at your public library. When you need to know, get to know your library. Log on to njlibraries.org.
Hi, we're back, and I'm Melissa. We have Jim, Larry, and Sarah, and we're just talking about books. Of course, during the break, we were off on a roll, moving all our books around and talking about it. But Larry is a genre person. He likes to look at books according to the different groups. Well, I think that's perfectly fair, and I had my little say about young adult books, and that is a genre. So maybe we'll sort of look at that as we go about whether we have certain kinds of books we like to read. But I also made Sarah and Jim grab some of the things they're currently reading right now. So show us what you got.
I have Pudd'nhead Wilson, and it's by Mark Twain. It's about a man who wanted to become a lawyer, except when he first moved to a town, he said something that everybody thought was dumb, and they started calling him Pudd'nhead Wilson, and he wasn't able to become a lawyer because of
Now,
that.
didn't you tell me that you're actually reading that aloud?
Yeah, I'm reading this aloud to my dad.
And do you find that that is a different experience of sitting down and reading something to yourself?
Yes, it is, because you have to pay closer attention to what you're reading.
And it must be wonderful with Mark Twain. I don't think I've ever done that. It sounds just delightful because he has such wonderful colloquial language.
Yeah.
You having fun with that?
It's hard, but it's fun. 'Cause
That's
he has
great.
a lot of dialect.
And you've not read it ahead of time, so you're
Mm.
just reading it. Oh, that's
Yeah.
a wonderful project. That's very cool. And what you have something that I loved years ago, and this makes me want to go back and read it again.
This is a book that I had on the reading list for maybe 40 years. And I always said, someday I'm going to get around to read that book, and I finally picked it up when I was in the bookstore recently and said, okay, now's the time. It's John Steinbeck, Travels with Charlie, and it really is a portrait of America in 1959, 1960, with an America that he sees coming that actually proved to be absolutely true. America of suburbs, an America of chain restaurants, an America that he didn't particularly like very much, but he was being observant about it. And it's an amazing book because, first of all, he was a great writer, but secondly, he was a very perceptive person, as a great novelist is. But in this case, he was doing reportage, and it was very perceptive. Not a long book. He skips over whole sections. He'll just drive through whole states and not stop when he gets it into his head. He's in a pickup truck in which he has a camper on the back, and Charlie is his poodle, and they're just off around the country.
Giant poodle,
Giant,
as I
yeah,
recall,
full standing
not
size
a teacup dog.
Right. And they make the complete circuit of the United States, and he even returns to Monterey, where he grew up, Salinas, because he's living in New York when this book occurs, out on the end of Long Island. And basically, his stop in Monterey is pretty much you can't go home again, you know. But it's a wonderful piece, and I only wish that I'd read it 40 years ago instead of recently.
Yeah, because now I'm going to get the pleasure of rereading it, because that definitely makes me want to do it. You know, back to the genre thing, I tend to get addicted to an author, and I did that at one point, and I think I read absolutely everything John Steinbeck wrote. I mean, everything, articles and everything I could find. And this is making me want to revisit some of that, though. But
Yep.
I know.
I was going to say, you're looking at the author. I was just thinking, when you said the word genre, the same thing, but in terms of the idea of travel, you know, and how this whole journey type of thing fits into American writing, whether it's something like Travels with Charlie, or maybe you've read Blue Highways,
Sure, yeah.
which is another one, or even Undaunted Courage, or Huckleberry Finn, for that matter, is sort of a journey type thing. You know, it's kind of intriguing, and I don't know that that's I don't know enough to know whether it's a particularly American type of writing, where you're going from one place to another, or if that's simply universal.
Well, it's interesting. I think it's a classic in a novel. It's a classic to have some kind of a journey, because that's a very literal way of having your character, you know, follow through and change over the course of time. It's majorly common in young adult stuff, where you're actually, you know, going from one place to another as far as your personality. So it often is done as a journey, but I bet there's an American flavor to it too. But science fiction is something we haven't discussed yet, and I know you read science fiction sometimes. You said your science fiction magazine.
Yeah, I have. I used to read it almost exclusively for many, many years. It was, in fact, probably one of the things that got me moving in the general direction when I went to college and so forth. But I always thought science fiction kind of took a turn for the worse when it became, because fantasy became much more popular. And those two genres, science fiction and fantasy, tended to be grouped together. And I always thought that it was harder to write good science fiction because you had to know a little bit about what some of the laws of nature were. And whereas with fantasy, there was always a way to introduce something just to get you off the hook. And the science fiction writer I really liked was a guy named Robert Heinlein, who's since died. And he wrote, to me, this kind of science fiction I liked was the one where you could hear the steam pipes clanking in the spaceships and stuff, that kind of stuff. And there's actually a current writer who reminds me a little bit of him called Alan Steele. But otherwise, I think science fiction's taken a turn from that so-called golden age. But
well, it's interesting that they are qualified the same, and the readers are often very different. My favorite definition of science fiction was, I heard someone say that the key difference between science fiction and fantasy is that in science fiction, the story is dependent on the science of the future or whatever. And that to call something like Star Wars science fiction is crazy because it's just fantasy. It's a fairy tale. It's set in a different time and place with different kinds of characters, but it's not dependent on its setting. It's not dependent on the spaceships. The story could happen, could be translated to any other location. And I thought that was kind of a nice distinction. I find that people who read one often don't cross over, but sometimes do. I know this is next on my reading list, which is a science fiction series, and I haven't read it yet. But that's because it's a trilogy, and the third one just came out, and I refuse to read trilogies until all three are written, because I hate that feeling hanging. I think it's the same, well, but then you could say that about the Harry Potter books, and people have been reading those without waiting for the last one to have been. Although now, anybody who starts can get the whole set. Did you bring a couple graphic novels? Because there's a whole nother genre that we didn't talk about yet.
Yes, I did. The main character is usually Asterix, who's the smaller character, and they're usually these two, Obelix and Asterix, fighting against the Romans and having a magic potion and going places to explore. And they usually have bad puns in them that you can understand, but you realize that they're not exactly
good from someone who grew up reading Amelia Bedelia or something, right? Mm-hmm. Just taken to a new level. So this format, did you, when you were littler, you weren't reading books probably that were in a comic format because they weren't so common. Now they write, little kids, they write the beginner reader books. Oh, if anybody remembers the Babysitter Clubs, which was one of the most popular chapter book series for what Nancy Drew was in the 1950s. This was in the 1990s. The Babysitter's Club, well, they're all being republished as graphic novels now. So, and there are little kids who are growing up on their beginner readers or more in a comic book or graphic novel format. So this is kind of new for you, right? That you're picking up these and reading them as books?
I've always read the comics in the paper, so I think that kind of helped me start reading these, and also a lot of the people in my family read these, so I just...
Have you read any adult graphic novels?
No,
or you've read
I
these?
have not. I read those from the time I was a boy. Asterix and Obelix have been around for quite some time. We were introduced to them by one of my relations who saw them originally in French. And these have all been translated. And they are wonderfully funny books, and it doesn't take long to read one. You can get through them in about an hour, but you find yourself just laughing out loud with quite a bit of it, beautifully drawn.
Oh, well, that's just nice to know. I am just starting to dip into the whole graphic novel format, because there's a lot of stuff written very seriously for adults that
Yes.
deals with, and back to your history again, that deals with some, very serious history and other big issues, and it's being done in this format, which is sort of a whole different, really different way to read. And I like books with pictures. I'm already a picture book fan, and it's just very different. So have you spread out from the Asterix ones and tried other stuff in this kind of format?
Not really. I've been meaning to get other comic books, but I haven't gotten a chance to, because a lot of the time people would prefer if I read chapter books and normal books.
That's true.
Mom and Dad have some input on the number of these books she's going to read.
Reading for your class too, and I don't think they've quite gotten to where, unless it's a project for the class, where you can say, oh yeah, this is what I'm reading for my class. Okay, we actually are running low on time here, so I want to make sure we hit, this looked really interesting to me, so I need you to say something about this. Arsenals of Folly by Richard Rhodes.
Yes, Richard Rhodes is the historian of the atomic age. He is the one who's written the definitive books on the development of the atomic bomb, the development of the H-bomb, hydrogen bomb. He is also wrote this particular book, which tracked the escalation of nuclear arsenals on both the Russian and the American side, from the beginning of the atomic age all the way up to the time when Gorbachev basically dismantled the Russian rockets. It's a sad book because of his words. Folly is absolutely correct. It was folly and foolhardy, much of what was done. And he has the history down to the documents, which he quotes liberally, which has one wincing as you read them.
I read one of his books called Farm, and I found it so incredibly absorbing. So the idea that you can just bury yourself in a nonfiction book is something to not forget. It's not just the fiction. So Larry, what one book are you going to leave us with? And you got a couple seconds to tell us about it.
Only a couple seconds. Well, I'll just think. Well, the book we just finished for their book club was Great Expectations, which I found a lot more interesting than I might have thought, considering, that it was written maybe 100 years ago. But I just leave you with one of my favorite books is maybe you've all read it, is The Once and Future King. I don't know if any of you've read that by T.H. White. Just sort of a
there's
retelling.
a great father and daughter one.
That's a nice
Oh,
book.
that's a lovely idea, and an exquisite writer too. That's T.H. White, who, was just a lovely command of language, and that's a good one. So that's great. And if you are interested in reading any of those books and forgot what they said, forgot what we talked about, just go into a library, any library, and, ask people, and we'll help you find the book. Thank you so much. I had such a good time. We could go on forever. Thank you, Sarah and Larry and Jim and myself, and that was fun. Let's do it again.